I'm Mary Elizabeth Kirke, a Loreto sister and our representative here in Peru of our NGO with the United Nations in New York. We have representatives all over the world. I'm very interested in saying a few words about the final address of the General Secretary Ban Ki-moon to the United Nations, to the General Assembly last September. I was really interested in reading what he said to them. I learned a great deal, especially about the wide base of the work of the United Nations. You know, we often think, why didn't the United Nations do this or that? They failed here or they failed there. But we don't realise the huge amount of work that goes on all the time. Emissaries are sent here, there and everywhere to make peace, to try and bring warring parties or parties with different interests together to avoid conflict. They're also involved in development and in human rights issues. And we know that these three things are so interlinked. You can't have development without peace and security. And you can't trample on human rights because you want economic progress. So there's a delicate balance between the three of them, and each of them is very important. And the United Nations keep these things in the forefront of our minds and in the forefront of politics at all times. Another aspect of the United Nations that interested me is that it's a very unusual association, entity, because we think of it as if the representatives, the high-level representatives, were there in New York all the time, but of course they're not. It only exists really as an entity when they're called. And the Secretary General has the work of calling them and setting an agenda in collaboration with them, but he himself doesn't have executive powers unless they're given to him. He only can operate, he can only make things happen with the mandate of the representatives, and indeed we know that if they block something, that the work can't go ahead. So you can imagine, if you'll excuse me using the word horse trading, that goes on, and the negotiations that go on, the conversations, interminable conversations that must go on before any great decision is reached. Any decision that takes into account the common good and not just the interests of individual nations. So for this, I think, although it's not it's not perfect, the United Nations has flaws, as does democracy, have many flaws, but as somebody said about democracy, it's full of flaws, it's really very unsuccessful in many aspects, but it's the best that we've got. You can see here behind me a little chart of the Sustainable Development Goals, and this surely has been one of the great successes of the United Nations last year in 2015, where 193 countries were represented in long negotiations about the way forward, about how in the next 15 years, how to tackle the issues of poverty, inequality, lack of development in our world, and the huge one of the destruction of our environment. And it has to be greatly to the credit of the United Nations that we have now a plan, the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think it behoves every one of us to work together in small ways and in great to further this plan, because it is the great hope, for me, it is the great hope of the future. I probably won't be here to see it finished, but I certainly want to commit myself wholeheartedly to cooperating with it. And there's one other thing that gives me great hope, and that is that Ban Ki-moon has told us that 8,000 enterprises worldwide have taken the SDGs on board. And this gives great hope, because although individuals and communities and nations can work to further these goals, unless big business, unless the multinationals, unless businesses big and small take them on board, we'll be fighting a losing battle. Also, unless there is peace. I think he points out that this has been the most challenging time ever for the United Nations. There are more people displaced in the world than ever before in the history of the United Nations. More serious conflicts, more conflicts between civilizations. And the United Nations is there to help us in this situation. Goodness knows what lies ahead, but at least the United Nations is in place and hopefully will go on reforming itself as well, as he called on the United Nations. He called out too in frustration against people who will not cooperate together, will not cooperate in issues of human development, in issues of development, in issues of human rights as well. But he has given us great hope, and I do think he's been a very wonderful General Secretary, a just man, what we would call a just man. Thank you for listening.